My name is Beatrice Langford, and I still remember the night my life changed forever. The night I held my husband's hand for the last time, waiting for words I both feared and longed to hear. We had been married for over 40 years, a lifetime of memories, struggles, triumphs, and quiet evenings filled with laughter and comfort. William wasn't just my husband, he was my partner in every sense of the word. He was the kind of man who noticed the little things, like how I always left the window cracked open just enough to let in the morning breeze, or how my hands trembled slightly when I was nervous. He never made grand declarations, but his love was in the way he brewed my tea exactly right, or how he warmed my side of the bed before I got in on cold nights. When we met, I was 21 and just starting my first job as a nurse. He was a young literature professor, always carrying books under his arm and speaking as though every word had weight. He used to joke that he fell in love with my handwriting before my smile, because I'd written a note for a faculty meeting we both attended. It felt like destiny the way we simply fit. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony under an oak tree, and I never once regretted saying yes. As the years passed, life brought its share of challenges. We raised 2 children, struggled financially when William lost his job, and leaned on each other when my father died unexpectedly. Through everything, we remained steady, two people weathering life's storms side by side. But nothing could have prepared me for the storm that came last year. It started with William feeling unusually tired. He brushed it off. At first, he was always a bit of a workaholic, writing essays and mentoring students even after retiring from teaching. But then came the weight loss. The nights he couldn't stop coughing the pain he tried so hard to hide from me. I still remember sitting in that sterile doctor's office, my hands cold against my lap as we waited for the test results. When the doctor finally spoke, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. Stage 4. Lung cancer, he said gently, as though softening the words would make them less cruel. I felt my world tilt. William simply nodded, his face calm in that infuriating way of his. Later that night, when I broke down in the kitchen sobbing into my hands, he held me and whispered, "B, we've faced hard things before. This is just another season." But this wasn't just another season. I became his caretaker as I had been for so many patients over the years, but this time every needle, every pill, every labored breath felt like a dagger twisting inside me. I tried to be strong for him, but every night when he was asleep, I'd sit in the dark and pray. Pray for more time, pray for a miracle, pray that I wouldn't have to face life without him. As the weeks turned into months, I could see him fading. His once strong frame grew frail, his voice softer, his hands colder. Yet he never complained. He'd still try to make me laugh, to remind me of the little joys, like how our granddaughter's drawing of us looked like two potatoes holding hands. And then that night came. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor. I sat by his bedside, clutching his hand, feeling the warmth slip away bit by bit. The nurse had stepped out, leaving us alone, just the two of us, like so many times before. I leaned close, tears streaming freely down my face. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm right here." His eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment it was like the years melted away. He looked at me with the same warmth he had on our wedding day. His lips trembled as he drew in a shallow breath, preparing to speak. Those were the last words I would ever hear from him, the words that would change my life, our family's future, and everything I thought I understood about love and purpose. Even now I can still hear his voice clear as day, as if time itself paused to let me remember every syllable. What he said next, I never saw coming. Before I tell you what William said, you have to understand the kind of man he was. His words carried weight, not because he was loud or commanding, but because he only spoke when he truly meant something. William was a thinker. He could sit for hours with a cup of coffee staring out the window and later share an observation so profound it made you question how you'd never thought of it yourself. He was quiet in a world that loved noise, steady in a world that loved speed. And he loved me with a constancy that made life feel safe, even when everything else felt uncertain. I remember our early years together, how we'd argue over little things like which way the toilet paper should hang, or how I'd always take up most of the blanket. But we always found our way back to each other, laughing in the middle of our disagreements because deep down, we knew nothing could shake what we had. When our children were born, first Clara, then James, he was the kind of father who never shied away from changing diapers or rocking them to sleep. He loved bedtime stories, and I can still picture him sitting cross-legged on the floor, our kids curled up on either side of him as he read The Wind in the Willows in his deep, calming voice. Even after the children grew up, moved out, and started their own lives, William never stopped being the center of our family. Holidays revolved around him, his silly jokes, his legendary pumpkin pie, his ability to make even the most awkward family gatherings feel warm. And yet, for all his quiet strength, William rarely shared his deepest feelings. It wasn't that he didn't have them. Oh, he felt deeply, but he preferred to show love through actions rather than words. Maybe that's why his last words carried so much power. In those final weeks as his illness progressed, we spent countless hours reminiscing. He'd tell me stories I'd never heard before, like how he almost didn't propose to me because he thought I was too good for him. I'd laugh and cry, holding his hand, soaking in every moment like it was the last drop of water in a desert. One night, just a week before his final breath, he asked me to bring out the old photo albums. We sat together, flipping through pictures of our younger selves so full of hope and possibility. There was one picture I couldn't stop staring at. Us standing outside our first apartment, grinning like fools, holding keys in our hands. We had so little back then: hand-me-down furniture, secondhand books, but so much joy. William looked at that picture for a long time before saying softly, "We really had it all, didn't we?" I nodded, tears welling up. "Yes, Will, we did." That night, as I tucked the album away, I felt an ache in my chest, a knowing ache. I realized we were nearing the end. And then came that night in the hospital, the night I told you about. I sat there gripping his hand like it was my lifeline, afraid that if I let go, he'd slip away completely. The monitor beeped softly, his breathing shallow but steady. His eyes met mine. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. Then, with all the strength he had left, William whispered the words that would haunt me, guide me, and ultimately transform everything about the life I thought I would live after he was gone. "B," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "Don't live for me. Live for you. Promise me. You'll finish what we never started." I froze. What did that mean? Finish what we never started? I wanted to ask, to beg him to explain, but before I could, his eyes fluttered closed and his hand went limp in mine. The room was silent. I couldn't cry. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there staring at him, my mind racing. What had he meant? What unfinished thing was he talking about? Those words, "Don't live for me. Live for you. Promise me you'll finish what we never started," echoed in my mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. In that moment, I didn't understand. I only felt hollow, like someone had carved out my chest and left me with an empty shell. But that night was the beginning of something I never expected. Because those words, cryptic, painful, and powerful, would soon change the entire course of my life. The hours after William's passing blurred together in a haze of disbelief. I sat in that hospital chair long after the nurses had gently covered his body and whispered their condolences. My hand still clutched his, even though the warmth had already left him. When our children arrived, their faces crumpled as they realized they were too late to hear their father's final words. Clara fell into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably, while James stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his jaw-tight, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. I wanted to tell them what William had said, but the words caught in my throat. It felt too raw, too unfinished, like sharing them before I understood them would somehow diminish their meaning. So instead, I just held my children close, letting the weight of grief settle over us like a heavy blanket. The funeral came a few days later. It was simple, just as William would have wanted. A few close friends, former students, and family gathered in the church where we'd been married decades ago. The pastor spoke of William's quiet wisdom, his unwavering kindness, and his love for learning, a love he had instilled in everyone who knew him. But as people shared stories, I found myself hearing William's last words over and over in my mind. Don't live for me, live for you. Promise me you'll finish what we never started. It was like a puzzle I couldn't solve. After the funeral, the house felt unbearably empty. I'd walk past his favorite chair and expect to see him there, sipping coffee and scribbling notes in the margins of a book. Evenings were the worst. The silence pressed in on me like a weight I couldn't bear. I tried to go through his belongings, thinking maybe I'd find a clue to what he'd meant. I opened drawers filled with old letters, lesson plans, and his handwriting so familiar it made my chest ache. I found photo albums, journals, even unfinished essays. But there was nothing that clearly said what he had meant by what we never started. One night, Clara came over with her 2 children. She made dinner, trying to bring some life back into the house. As we sat at the table, her daughter Lucy, just 6 years old, looked up at me with her big brown eyes and asked, "Grandma, why do you look so sad?" It was such an innocent question, and yet it pierced straight through me. I realized I had been drifting through life, existing rather than living. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of tea William used to make for me. I pulled out one of his old journals and began reading. Most entries were about literature, reflections on teaching, or notes for essays he wanted to write. But one entry stopped me cold. Dated 15 years ago, it read, "B and I keep talking about opening that community learning center, a place where anyone, young or old, can discover the joy of reading and learning. We always say we'll do it someday. But what if someday never comes?" I felt my breath catch. The community learning center. It was something we'd talked about for years, a dream of ours that never got past the planning stage because life kept getting in the way. Kids, bills, responsibilities. There was always a reason to wait. And now William's final words suddenly made sense. Finish what we never started. He wasn't just telling me to live for myself. He was giving me permission, maybe even urging me to finally chase the dream we had both let slip away. For the first time since he passed, my tears felt different. They weren't just grief anymore. They were mixed with something else. A spark of understanding, maybe even hope. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. For weeks, I'd dreaded mornings because waking up meant facing another day without William. But that day felt different. I went straight to the attic, rummaging through boxes that hadn't been opened in years. There, under stacks of old holiday decorations and forgotten keepsakes, I found a large folder labeled Community Learning Center. Ideas. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were pages of notes, hand-drawn floor plans, lists of potential names for the center. There was even a budget outline scrawled in William's familiar handwriting filled with his meticulous calculations. I sat on the dusty floor reading through every page. With each note, I could hear his voice again, his passion for teaching, his belief that learning could change lives. It was like he was still here, guiding me, reminding me that the dream we'd once shared was still alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a choice pressing down on me. For years, I'd defined myself by my roles: wife, mother, grandmother. I'd taken care of everyone else, often putting my own desires last. William had always supported me, but I never truly stepped out of my comfort zone to chase something just for myself. His final words: "Don't live for me, live for you. Promise me you'll finish what we never started," weren't just a wish. They were a challenge. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I drove to the town hall, the same place where William and I had once inquired about permits for the learning center years ago. I spoke to a clerk named Helen who listened patiently as I explained my plan. "You want to open a community center at your age?" she asked, raising her eyebrows, though not unkindly. I smiled faintly. "Yes, at my age. Because if not now, then when?" She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Good for you. We don't see enough people chasing their dreams this late in life." Leaving the building, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: purpose. When I told Clara and James about my decision, their reactions couldn't have been more different. Clara hugged me, tears in her eyes. "Mom, that's incredible. Dad would be so proud." James, however, looked concerned. "Mom, Are you sure this is a good idea? It's a lot of work, a lot of responsibility. Maybe it's too much. I took a deep breath, meeting his worried gaze. James, your father spent his whole life teaching others to believe in themselves. He believed in this dream. And for the first time in my life, I'm going to believe in myself too. That night, I went through William's journal again, reading every entry about the center. His words felt like breadcrumbs leading me forward, showing me the path he hoped I'd take. For the first time since losing him, I felt like I wasn't just grieving, I was moving. I didn't know how long it would take, or how hard it would be. But I knew deep in my soul that I couldn't let his last words go unanswered. This was how I would honor him. Not by clinging to the past, but by building the future we once dreamed of together. Starting was the hardest part. The folder of ideas was full of William's careful notes, but most of them were outdated funding sources that no longer existed, potential locations that had since been demolished or repurposed. Still, it was a foundation, and for me, it felt like a lifeline. I began by reaching out to old friends and former colleagues. Some had been teachers with me. Others were William's former students now, adults with families of their own. When I told them what I planned to do, some were enthusiastic while others hesitated. "It's a wonderful idea, B," one old friend said gently, "but it's so much work. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Her doubt stung, but I understood it. I had asked myself the same question 100 times. But every time fear tried to creep in, I heard William's voice in my mind. "Don't live for me. Live for you. Finish what we never started." I pushed on. Clara became my strongest supporter. She helped me research grants and community funding programs, while Lucy, sweet, curious, Lucy kept asking when the reading house would open. James remained skeptical, though not unsupportive. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Mom," he said one night over dinner. Losing Dad was already so hard. "What if this doesn't work out?" I placed my hand over his. "James, losing your father taught me something I can't ignore anymore. Life's too short to wait for the right time. I can't let fear stop me." Weeks turned into months. I found an old brick building downtown, long abandoned but still structurally sound. Its large windows were dusty and the paint was peeling. But when I stepped inside, I felt something like William was there with me, smiling at the possibilities. The landlord, an older man named Frank, was touched when I explained my plans. "My wife was a teacher," he said softly. "She would have loved this idea. I'll give you a fair price for the lease." Renovating the place was exhausting. There were days when my back ached, my hands blistered, and doubt gnawed at me. But each day, I left the building covered in dust and sweat. I felt alive in a way I hadn't since before William got sick. One evening, as I scrubbed paint off my hands, Clara stopped by with dinner. She looked around the half-finished space and smiled. "You know, Mom, Dad would have been right there with you, probably bossing everyone around about where the bookshelves should go." I laughed, my chest tightening with bittersweet joy. "Yes," I whispered. I can almost hear him now. As I stood in that space surrounded by half-built shelves and the smell of fresh paint, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about fulfilling William's dream. It was about finally stepping into my own life, choosing to live fully even after loss. For the first time since his death, the grief didn't feel like an anchor. It felt like a compass. The official opening day of the Learning Center arrived sooner than I expected. I stood outside the refurbished brick building, the morning sun warming my face. The sign above the door read, "The Marwood Learning Center." William's last name, a way to keep his presence alive in the heart of this dream. As volunteers and neighbors gathered, I felt a lump form in my throat. Clara stood beside me, holding Lucy's hand while James lingered nearby, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen since the funeral. I took a deep breath and stepped forward to speak. "Thank you all for being here today." I began, my voice shaking slightly. "This place is more than just a building. It's a promise, one my husband and I made to each other a long time ago, a promise we never got to fulfill together. But today we're finally finishing what we started." There were tears in the crowd, and for a moment I had to steady myself. I cut the ribbon and the doors opened. Inside, the space was filled with shelves of books, colorful reading nooks, and tables for tutoring and workshops. It was everything William and I had envisioned: simple, warm, welcoming. As people explored, children ran to the reading corners, their laughter echoing through the once empty halls. Volunteers greeted families, helping them sign up for literacy programs and classes. Watching it all unfold, I felt an overwhelming mix of pride and sorrow. I wished William could have seen it, could have stood beside me smiling that quiet smile of his. That night, after everyone had left, I stayed behind to tidy up. The center was quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It felt alive. I sat at one of the tables, exhausted yet deeply fulfilled. For the first time in months, I spoke to William aloud. "We did it, Will," I whispered. "I finally understand. You didn't want me to fade away after you were gone. You wanted me to live, and you wanted our dream to live too." It was in that moment that the full weight of his final words finally settled in my heart. "Don't live for me. Live for you. Finish what we never started." He hadn't just given me permission to keep living, he had given me purpose. From that day on, the center became my second home. I threw myself into the work, teaching literacy classes, organizing events, and watching as people's lives changed just as William had always believed they could. And with each passing day, I felt closer to him, as though he were guiding me through every small victory. The grief was still there. It probably always would be. But now it no longer chained me to the past. Instead, it pushed me toward a future I never thought I'd have the courage to claim. Running the center became more than just a project. It became my lifeline. Each morning, I woke up with a purpose that carried me through the lingering ache of William's absence. The community embraced the center faster than I could have imagined. Retirees volunteered as tutors, high school students helped organize book drives, and parents signed their children up for after-school programs. Within months, we had regular classes in reading, creative writing, and even life skills workshops for adults who never finished school. One afternoon, as I was organizing donated books, a young boy named Samuel approached me. He was about 9 years old, shy and soft-spoken, clutching a worn-out copy of Charlotte's Web. "Mrs. Langford," he said timidly, "this is the first book I've ever read by myself. Thank you for helping me." My chest tightened, tears threatening to spill over. I knelt down to his level and smiled. "No, Samuel, thank you. You've just reminded me why this place exists." Moments like that felt like gifts, like William was speaking to me through these small victories, reassuring me that I was exactly where I needed to be. But despite all the joy the center brought, there were challenges too. Some nights I stayed late, balancing the budget, worrying if we'd have enough funds to keep the doors open. There were repairs that seemed to appear out of nowhere: leaky pipes, a malfunctioning heater, a roof that needed patching. James remained wary. He visited one evening after work, watching me stack chairs at the end of a long day. "Mom," he said softly, "you're working too hard. This is supposed to be your time to rest. Dad wouldn't want you to run yourself ragged." I set down the chair and met his eyes. "James, I'm tired, yes. But I've never felt more alive. Your father didn't tell me to stop living. He told me to start. And that's exactly what I'm doing." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then slowly he nodded, a trace of pride flickering across his face. Weeks later, James surprised me by volunteering at one of the weekend workshops. Watching him read stories to a group of children brought tears to my eyes. For the first time, I felt like William's legacy wasn't just mine to carry, it was spreading to our children too. Late one night, as I locked up the center, I sat for a moment in the quiet. The air smelled faintly of old books and fresh paint. I looked around at the walls lined with shelves and thought of William, how proud he would be. "See this, Will," I whispered into the stillness. "We're really doing it. Your words. They didn't just save me, they saved us." And in that moment, I realized something profound. William's last words weren't a farewell. They were a beginning. The more time I spent at the center, the more I understood the depth of William's message. His final words weren't simply about finishing a project. They were about reclaiming my own life, a life I had unconsciously put on hold for decades while caring for everyone else. I had loved being a wife, a mother, a grandmother. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten what it meant to simply be me. The center became a mirror reflecting back the parts of myself I thought had disappeared. The woman who once dreamed boldly, who believed she could make a difference. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Late at night, after long days at the center, I'd sit at my desk and pour my thoughts onto paper, memories of William, the lessons he taught me, and the way grief had reshaped my understanding of love and purpose. Clara encouraged me to turn those writings into essays for the local paper. When my first piece was published, an article titled "The Gift of My Husband's Last Words," the response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from people who had lost loved ones, thanking me for giving them hope that life could still hold meaning after loss. One letter stood out. It was from a widower named Henry, who wrote, "Your words made me realize I've been living in my wife's shadow since she passed. It's time for me to live again, too. Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It changes, but it doesn't end." I cried as I read his words. For the first time, I saw clearly that William's last message wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever been frozen by grief, afraid to keep moving forward. Still, there were days when doubt crept in. What if I can't keep this up? I confessed to Clara one evening as we cleaned up after an event. What if I fail and all of this falls apart? She put her arm around me, her voice steady. "Mom, you're not failing. You're living Dad's dream. And you've inspired more people than you know. He believed in you. And now, so do I." Those words hit me deeper than I expected. For so long, I'd measured my worth by how well I supported others. But slowly, I was beginning to see that I had something to give, beyond being a wife or a mother. William's last words had done more than guide me toward a dream. They had set me free. One night, after everyone had gone, I stayed late at the center. I sat at a table in the reading corner, staring at the journal where William had once written his hopes for this place. My fingers traced the ink-stained pages, and I whispered softly into the quiet room, "I get it now, Will. You didn't just want me to finish the center. You wanted me to find myself again." And for the first time since he passed, I didn't just feel his absence. I felt his presence everywhere. With each passing month, the center grew, not just in size, but in spirit. What began as a modest idea had blossomed into a true community hub. We now had volunteers teaching music, art, and even basic computer skills for seniors who had never touched a laptop before. One of my proudest moments came when we hosted our first community book fair. Children ran between tables stacked with donated books, while local authors gave readings. The air buzzed with excitement, laughter, and the faint scent of fresh coffee from the little corner cafe we'd set up. As I looked around, I felt a deep warmth in my chest. It was exactly how William and I had imagined it all those years ago. But the center wasn't the only thing that was changing. I was changing too. I found myself saying yes to things I would have once avoided. When a volunteer suggested starting a public speaking club, I surprised myself by agreeing to be the first speaker. Standing in front of a group of strangers telling them about William and his final words was terrifying, but liberating. And the response was incredible. After my talk, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said softly. "I've been afraid to really live since then. But hearing your story, maybe it's time I try again." Moments like that reminded me that William's legacy wasn't just in this building, it was in every life we touched. Still, life wasn't without its challenges. Funding was a constant concern. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if we'd have to shut down. But somehow, just when hope seemed thin, help always came: an anonymous donation, a grant approval, a fundraiser that exceeded expectations. Clara and James remained by my side. Clara was my biggest cheerleader, while James, still cautious, began to soften. One evening, as we closed up the center together, he finally said, "Mom, I didn't think you could do this. But I was wrong. I'm proud of you." Those words undid me. I hugged him tightly, tears spilling down my cheeks. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I opened William's journal again. I found an entry I'd somehow overlooked before, dated just a month before his diagnosis. "Life isn't about the years we have. It's about the dreams we dare to chase before time runs out. If we never start, we'll always wonder what could have been." Reading that, I finally understood William hadn't been afraid of dying. He had been afraid of not living fully. His last words weren't just a wish for me to keep going. They were his final lesson that love means setting someone free to become who they're meant to be, even after you're gone. And I was finally becoming that woman. The more the center flourished, the more it became a living tribute to William. People began to call it the heart of the town. Parents brought their children after school, seniors gathered for coffee and conversation, and young adults came to study for exams or simply find a quiet place to read. One evening, we held a dedication ceremony to honor William. I had hesitated at first. It felt strange to celebrate him so publicly, but Clara convinced me it was the right thing to do. That night, the center was packed. Former students of Williams shared stories of how he'd inspired them to pursue careers in teaching, writing, and even social work. Some of them hadn't seen me in decades, but their eyes shone as they spoke about the man who had shaped their lives. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium clutching a piece of paper with trembling hands. William never needed recognition, I began. He believed the greatest measure of a life well lived was in the people we help along the way. This center, it isn't just mine, it's his, and it's yours. Because he taught me, and so many of you, that dreams are only worth something if we share them. As I spoke, I felt an extraordinary sense of peace. For months, grief had felt like a shadow I couldn't escape. But standing there, surrounded by the lives William had touched, I realized that his presence wasn't gone. It had simply changed form. After the ceremony, James approached me. He'd been quiet all evening, standing in the back of the room. "Mom," he said softly, "I think I finally get it. Dad didn't want you to just survive without him. He wanted you to live, really live." I smiled, tears in my eyes. "Yes, James. That's exactly what he wanted." A few weeks later, something happened that cemented everything William had ever believed in. A young, single mother named Rosa came to the center struggling to improve her English so she could find better work. She was shy, almost apologetic as she explained her situation. Within months, Rosa's confidence blossomed. She not only improved her language skills, but she also secured a job that allowed her to support her son and move into a safer home. The day she came to tell me the news, she hugged me tightly and said, "You didn't just change my life. You changed my son's future." I held back tears, realizing that William's dream had grown far beyond what either of us could have imagined. Later that night, I sat alone in the quiet center, a single lamp casting warm light over the room. I placed my hand on William's journal, whispering, "We did it, Will. We really did it." It struck me then his final words had been less about me fulfilling his dream and more about me discovering my own power. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely alive. As the months turned into a year, the center became more than just a tribute to William. It became a legacy for our entire family. Clara and James both found ways to be involved. Clara organized community events while James helped set up a scholarship fund in William's name for students who couldn't afford college. The night we announced the first scholarship recipient, I felt as if William was sitting beside me, his hand resting gently on mine. The recipient was a young man named Daniel, the first in his family to finish high school. When he stepped up to the podium to accept the scholarship, his voice shook as he said, "If not for this center, I never would have believed I had a future. You gave me hope." I looked out at the crowd, parents wiping tears, children beaming with pride, and realized that William's influence had rippled outward in ways neither of us could have predicted. After the event, James pulled me aside. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't see it at first. I thought you were trying to hold on to Dad by doing this, but now, I get it. You're not just honoring him, you're carrying his love forward. And you've taught me more about courage than I ever thought possible." I hugged him tightly. "Your father's last words weren't just for me, James. They were for all of us." It was true. The center had changed Clara too. She told me she'd been inspired to go back to school and pursue a degree in social work. "I want to make a difference just like Dad did," she said. Even Lucy, my sweet granddaughter, found her own way to honor William. She wrote a short story for a school assignment called "The Man Who Believed in Books." Her teacher read it aloud to the class, and Lucy proudly told everyone it was about her grandpa. One evening, after locking up the center, I stood outside under the quiet glow of the streetlights. The air was cool, and the world felt still, as if holding its breath. For so long after William's passing, I thought my life had ended with his. But now I saw the truth. His last words hadn't been a goodbye. They had been a handoff. He had trusted me to carry the torch not just for him, but for myself, and for everyone whose lives we would touch along the way. As I walked home, the night sky stretched endlessly above me. For the first time, I didn't feel small or alone. I felt part of something much bigger than myself. And I finally understood that William's greatest gift wasn't the center or even his love. It was his faith in me. Running the center wasn't always easy. As the programs expanded, so did the responsibilities. There were months when donations came in slowly, and I worried about paying the bills. Some nights I'd sit at my desk surrounded by receipts and grant applications, feeling the old fear creeping back in. But then I'd look at William's journal, always sitting nearby, and remember why I started. Live for you. Finish what we never started. Those words weren't just encouragement anymore. They had become a promise I refused to break. One of the biggest challenges came when the roof began leaking during a heavy spring storm. Repairs were expensive, and the budget was already tight. I considered closing the center temporarily, but the thought of locking those doors even for a few weeks felt unbearable. When I explained the situation to the community, something remarkable happened. Volunteers showed up with buckets, tarps, and tools. A local contractor offered to fix the roof at half price. Donations poured in even from people I barely knew. Standing there watching neighbors climb ladders and patch holes in the pouring rain, I realized just how far William's dream had reached. It wasn't just my dream anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of second chances. That night, after the storm passed, I stayed late to mop up the remaining puddles. As I worked, I thought about how grief had once felt like an endless ocean threatening to drown me. But now I understood something profound. Grief doesn't have to be an anchor. It can be a bridge connecting what we've lost to what we still have yet to build. A few weeks later, during one of our evening literacy classes, I watched as a grandmother about my age read a children's book aloud for the very first time. Her voice wavered, but her smile was radiant. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. She looked at me with tears streaming down her cheeks. I never thought I'd be able to do this. Thank you. I swallowed the lump in my throat and managed to whisper, "No, thank you." Moments like that reminded me why I kept pushing forward even on the hardest days. William hadn't just left me with final words. He'd left me with a map, one that led me not back to him, but forward to a life I never thought I'd have the courage to live. And every step I took was proof that his faith in me hadn't been misplaced. The second anniversary of William's passing approached, and I wanted to mark it in a way that truly honored him. I decided to host a Legacy Day at the center, a celebration of learning, storytelling, and community service. We invited local authors, teachers, and volunteers to share their skills, and the turnout exceeded anything I could have imagined. The building was alive with energy. Children painting murals, teenagers teaching seniors how to use tablets, parents reading with their kids. Everywhere I looked, there were smiles, laughter, and quiet moments of connection. At the end of the day, I stood on the small stage at the front of the main room, gazing at the crowd. My heart felt so full it ached. This center was once just an idea. I said, my voice trembling. A dream my husband and I carried for years but never acted on. When he died, I thought that dream had died with him. But his last words reminded me that it wasn't too late, not for me, and not for any of us. He told me, "Don't live for me, live for you. Finish what we never started." And because of that, all of you are here today. The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for William, for the power of a dream carried forward, and for everyone who believed they could still change their lives, no matter how much time had passed. Later that night, after the event ended, I walked through the now empty rooms of the center. Streamers and balloons still hung from the ceiling, and the faint scent of baked goods lingered in the air. I sat down at one of the tables, exhaustion settling into my bones, but my heart felt light. Pulling William's journal from my bag, I opened it to the page where he'd first written about the Learning Center. I traced the words with my fingertips and whispered, "We did it, Will. We really did it. And we're not done yet." Because that was the truth. This wasn't the end of William's legacy. It was only the beginning. In that moment, I realized something profound. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It continues to grow, to ripple outward, carried by the lives we touch and the choices we make. William's final words hadn't just changed my life. They had changed countless others too. And I knew without a doubt that he would have been proud. A few months after Legacy Day, something happened that brought everything full circle. A letter arrived at the center addressed to me in neat handwriting. Inside was a note from Henry the widower, who had once written to thank me for sharing my story in the newspaper. "Dear Beatrice, because of you, I started volunteering at my local library. I teach adults how to read. For the first time since my wife passed, I feel alive again. Thank you for helping me remember that love never really leaves. It just changes." Reading his words, I felt tears slide down my cheeks. I had shared William's message with the world, and now it was spreading far beyond what either of us could have imagined. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the evening air cool against my skin. Fireflies danced in the yard, and for a moment, I felt William's presence as vividly as the day we first met. "Will," I whispered into the night. "Your last words didn't just save me. They've become a lifeline for so many others. You gave me the courage to live, and now that courage is lighting up lives far beyond our own." The center had grown so much that we were planning to open a second location in a neighboring town. Volunteers stepped up to help lead programs, and donations arrived from people who had never even met William, but believed in what he stood for. Even James, once so skeptical, became deeply involved. One evening, as we sorted through scholarship applications, he looked at me and said, "Mom, I think Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He knew you'd find your strength if he asked you to finish this dream." I smiled through tears. Yes, James. He believed in me more than I believed in myself. That realization was both humbling and empowering. William had always seen the woman I could be, the one who wasn't afraid to dream, to lead, to make a difference. And now, finally, I had become her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender, I felt a quiet peace wash over me. I didn't just feel like William's widow anymore. I felt like myself, a woman who had lost but also gained, a woman who understood that grief could be a teacher as much as love had been. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. William's last words would continue to echo through every life I touched long after I was gone. The third anniversary of William's passing arrived quietly, without the crushing grief that once defined those early days. Instead, it felt like a gentle reminder, a chance to honor the man whose love had shaped my life and whose final words had set me free. That morning, Clara, James, and I visited William's grave. We brought his favorite flowers, sunflowers, and stood together in silence for a long time. Finally, I knelt beside his headstone, tracing his name with my fingertips. "Will I?" whispered my voice steady. "We finished it. The center is thriving. Clara's going back to school. James helps run the scholarship fund. And me, I'm living just like you asked me to. I hope you're proud." A breeze rustled through the trees, and for a fleeting moment I felt as if he was there, smiling that quiet, knowing smile. Later that day, we hosted a celebration at the center. It wasn't somber. It was joyful. Children read aloud stories they'd written, adults shared how the center had changed their lives, and neighbors came together like family. As I looked around the room, I realized William's last words had done far more than change my life. They had sparked a chain reaction of courage, kindness, and hope. After everyone left, I remained behind, sitting at one of the tables in the softly lit room. The center was quiet, but it felt alive, filled with echoes of laughter and new beginnings. I pulled William's journal from my bag, now worn and smudged from years of use, and opened to his first entry about the center. "Dream boldly," it read. I smiled through tears, closing the journal gently. "We did," Will, I whispered. "And we still are." Looking around, I realized that love, true love, doesn't vanish. It transforms. It becomes legacy, impact, and the courage to keep living when it would be easier to stop. William's final words weren't just for me. They were for everyone who has ever faced loss and wondered if life could still hold meaning. And as long as I draw breath, I'll keep sharing that message. Don't live for the person you lost. Live for you. Finish what you never started. Because sometimes the greatest gift someone can leave behind is the belief that your story isn't over yet. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who has loved deeply and lost painfully. When William took his last breath, I thought my life had ended with his. But his final words reminded me that love can be more than memory. It can be action, courage, and the spark that keeps us moving forward. I hope my journey shows you that grief doesn't have to mean the end. It can be a beginning, a chance to finally become the person you were always meant to be. William believed in me long before I believed in myself. And through his final gift, those few powerful words, he gave me a future I didn't know I still had. If you've lost someone you love, please know this. The love you shared doesn't end. It becomes part of you, guiding you toward new chapters you never imagined you'd write. I encourage you to share your own story in the comments. Tell us about the words, the memories, or the lessons your loved ones left behind that still guide you today. Because love, real love, never truly leaves us. It simply finds a new way to stay. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, don't just live for those you've lost. Live for you. And if you've been waiting for someday to chase your own dream, let this be your sign. Start now.